Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 226, the Stoneman Raid of 1865. So last time we had a general analysis for George B. McClellan. As Little Mac's career was played out pretty much in the entirety of our narrative, I think we did a good job throughout the episodes throwing some of the points that we already covered in last time's episode out. However, I do think having it all together in just one place is still helpful. This week, we actually cover an event that we did not get to in the narrative. There's a small short list of events that we actually missed or skipped over, or otherwise they were overlooked. This is one of them that we need to go back and redo and talk about, and that's going to be Stoneman's Raid in 1865. Before we get into that raid, though, we do need to talk about some Patreon content, and of course, we have a general draft that we did here as part of a little extra different type of Patreon episode. We have that posted. We have movie reviews posted. We're going to do Emancipation pretty soon. Then we're going to go back to the well of memoir reviews as well. So we have a good schedule coming up of those. If any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. Now we talked a little about George Stoneman in our main narrative episodes. Some of you may remember he had commanded infantry before cavalry briefly, but let us recount a little about Stoneman. Stoneman was from Western New York. He attended West Point in a class that included George Pickett as well as McClellan. We mentioned before how he's in that famous class there of West Pointers, and he actually is going to be roommates with Stonewall Jackson. So Jackson was kind of a little bit of an oddball, as we talked about during his analysis episode. Well, George Stoneman is the guy who's going to be living with him, right? So obviously he kind of has a very unique perspective on Jackson, who, once again, everyone kind of found him a little bit off or a little bit strange. Stoneman, weirdly enough, is going to actually have the kind of temperament to sort of be still close to Jackson, although you really don't get a whole lot of people who are very, very close to him at all. Post-graduating, he would be assigned to cavalry. During the war with Mexico, he would join Phil Kearny and his expedition to California. We did a brief rundown on the war with Mexico, but honestly, we might do a miniseries to really delve a little deeper on the Texas War of Independence, and then Mexico, as I think sometimes is overlooked. The California adventure in this case is not a theme park, but rather it is Kearny capturing the Pacific Territory for the United States. Remember that the expansion in this general area is going to be a key war goal. It's going to be part of the reason why the war is seen as kind of unpopular, because it's sort of a land grab. This is where we sort of get manifest destiny as well. These kinds of topics that maybe we've covered in previous episodes, or maybe you've heard about in your previous history classes, right? Well, here we have a very nice case in point example of Kearny kind of making a beeline for California to make sure that that's territory that is going to fall into the fold of the United States. And actually, during the peace negotiations, there is a little bit of talk about giving some of this stuff back to Mexico. However, they're going to still remain in the hands of America. And then we get, of course, California and Oregon and Washington as well, or at least parts of that, as well as Arizona and New Mexico. Stoneman would remain in California and develop some relationships there, as he would relocate after the war and become the governor of that state in 1882. Prior to the Civil War, he would serve in the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, which was a unit that many Civil War generals cut their teeth in. At the outbreak of hostilities, Stoneman would be attached to the staff of George B. McClellan, and eventually parlayed this into commanding the cavalry in the Eastern Theater. This early in the conflict, though, cavalry is usually going to be in the command of infantry divisions. It is not centralized like artillery, so this left Stoneman with little to do. You kind of see the order of battle for some of these engagements, like say on the peninsula or 7 days, you see these cavalry units that are going to be attached to these various infantry divisions. Artillery is going to be organized very much in the same way, but then it becomes more efficient to have it centralized, both in the sense of artillery and then cavalry as well. And the Confederates actually start to do that with Jeb Stuart, kind of organizing the cavalry and having it under his overall control. So that seems to be more efficient for not only on the march or campaigning, but also on the battlefield as well. So that is where we get that. Stoneman would suffer from hemorrhoids, though, so he was going to actually have to take a back seat. Taking the helm of a new unified cavalry, he would set out on a raid to cut off rebel supply prior to the Battle of Chancellorsville, though. This would be part of Joe Hooker's attack plan, if you recall. But weather and general indecisiveness would plague Stoneman, his raid really accomplishing very little. Post-Chancellorsville, if you recall, there is going to be a lot of blame that goes around, and Hooker is going to have a triumvirate of blame for why he's going to lose the battle. Obviously, the first is going to be Howard, whose 12th Corps had been manhandled by Jackson. The second was going to be Sedgwick, who did not press soon enough or hard enough at 2nd Fredericksburg. And then the third is going to be George Stoneman and his ineffectual cavalry raid. There's always going to be this kind of thought process, and maybe some of it is a little bit embellished after the fact, but Joe Hooker is constantly going to be like, well, don't worry, Stoneman's about to disrupt their supply lines, and the Confederates are going to have to withdraw because they have a huge amount of cavalry in their rear that's making their position untenable. So even though he has this contact point at the first day at Chancellorsville, he still has Sedgwick on one side of the river, and he's not facing a whole lot of men against him. You'll have Early's division, but there is kind of this thought process throughout there. Joe Hooker is just going to kind of dig in and say, hey, let's just wait for Stoneman to go ahead and do his thing, and then eventually we're going to have a battle in open country. And that's kind of one of the reasons why he doesn't continue to act offensively, and why that first day at Chancellorsville is so important, where Stonewall Jackson kind of punches him in the mouth and pushes him back into the wilderness. Out of those three, though, Stoneman is going to feel the most heat, as he's going to be relegated to a desk job, albeit very briefly. He's going to be assigned to Schofield in the Army of the Ohio, rising to command Sherman's cavalry. Perhaps eager to wash away what he had done in Virginia, Stoneman is going to convince Sherman to attempt a cavalry raid that's going to liberate prisoners, while also destroying the railroad. Remember, Sherman's really more interested in the railroad, but he wants to liberate prisoners, Andersonville being a considered target. The raid would be botched from the beginning, eventually Joe Wheel's cavalry catching up with him and forcing his surrender. Exchanged for Daniel Govan, Stoneman would linger. Eventually, he would be reallocated into Kentucky, where he would set his sights in southwest Virginia, and then the Carolinas. Remember, in 1864, Stephen Burbridge had a failed attempt on Saltville. This is where we had Champ Ferguson with other partisans who are going to give no quarter to not only United States colored troops, but also pro-Union Tennessee and Kentucky soldiers. And this is where Stoneman's going to have an idea. He's going to be looking to capitalize on a raid yet again. Originally, he's going to wish to get into South Carolina, the western portion of that state, and North Carolina being less likely to mount a defense. Remember, the more you get into that mountainous region of both those states, as opposed to the low country, or so it's called, then you're going to have more pro-Union individuals, kind of like East Tennessee. In his command would be a lot of pro-Union Southern regiments from Tennessee and Kentucky. But with the cautious delay of Stoneman, he's going to lose on an initial opportunity. He had some 6,000 troopers, with mounts and Spencers sent from George Thomas. But Sherman had already moved through Columbia, so Stoneman was urged to act by Grant. If he was able to lay waste to southwest Virginia, he could destroy railroads and any hope of resupply to Petersburg. From there, he could turn into North Carolina to help destroy the infrastructure of any escape route or supply for not only Lee, but also other Confederate forces gathering in the Tar Heel state. Remember that even though there's kind of an overall feeling that the war is kind of drawing to a close, it's not outside the realm of possibility that if Lee is able to escape with the Confederate government from Richmond, from Petersburg, and unite with Joseph Johnston's army, there's a real opportunity that the war could continue, and that's going to have a continued loss of life. And certainly, continuation of the war is not going to be something that any of these generals particularly want from the Union side. Grant wants it to be finished, and he has a very good idea that if Lee is forced to surrender, then it is going to, in fact, be over. So any kind of support to helping him accomplish that goal is going to be very welcome. And of course, he has a very, you could have controversial, I guess, sort of example of a aggressive cavalry leader in the form of Phil Sheridan, who's going to really help him, especially in the campaign for Appomattox. We actually briefly mentioned the force assembled that moved into Southwest Virginia, this being 3 brigades, notably with Alvin Gillem as a second-in-command to Stoneman. Gillem was from East Tennessee, his loyalties remaining with the Union, George Thomas being a close friend. The 1st Brigade was under Delaware emancipationist John Palmer and contained regiments from Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The 2nd Brigade would be led by Simeon Brown, commanding the 11th Michigan and 2 Kentucky cavalry regiments. Brown was from Michigan, having run a hotel before the war. The last brigade, we have also briefly mentioned, was commanded by John K. Miller. This brigade would contain the 8th and 9th Tennessee, 2 regiments that were huge protagonists in the Civil War within a civil war. They would be marked by their brutal tactics against pro-Confederates in the region. Remember, we sort of talked about this when referring to Fort Pillow. Part of the reason why the engagement turned into a massacre is that there were loyal Tennessee regiments that would be sort of fed up with the state being run by slave-holding elite. There had been, of course, an attempt for the eastern part of the state to free itself and make it their own state prior to the war. Within the war, this animosity reached critical mass, there being violent incidents between both sides. We often talk about the brutal war in Missouri. Well, you can also point to Tennessee and Kentucky for the same sort of experience. Stoneman would wish to mask the intentions of the raid. He would divide his command and move into the gaps in the Appalachian Mountains. Part of his command would briefly skirmish with men under John C. Vaughan, but otherwise there would be little action. Moving into North Carolina, the cavalry would be met with loyalists mostly in this region. The column would be able to move into Boone and there skirmish with Confederate Home Guard. This was a brisker fight, wounding some 5 or so troopers before Boone was occupied, the Home Guard scattering. Reportedly, there would be multiple civilians who were gunned down by the Union cavalry, the circumstances of which are not as well known. What is known, as perhaps they were outed as potential Confederates, and some looting of the town would occur, the troopers from Kentucky especially getting involved in the taking of goods. Something else that we've actually also overlooked when we talked about these regiments and these regions as well, especially like East Tennessee, we have mentioned before how Union officers would write about how just kind of desolate the country was. This is going to be a poorer region, right? These mountain countries are going to be poorer individuals who are going to be joining the army, and so looting to them is going to be a viable way in which they can acquire some sort of wealth out of this venture, right? So you're going to see a lot of that with some of these regiments. With Boone secure, Stoneman would set his eye on Virginia. He would do well to secure his lines of communication and retreat. Obviously, I'm sure that the High Command was also well aware that Stoneman had been forced to retreat 2 times on raids in key situations that might have proved disastrous. Indeed, we have talked about Chancellorsville before, the Atlanta raid also having a large amount of troopers captured. At one point, the cavalry scattering in an attempt to escape. Even in the latter stages of the war, the avoidance of a similar event was on the mind of most involved. But Stoneman is not going to go ahead and call it a day. He's going to cross the Yadkin River and have a combined command on April 1st, ready to again move on Christiansburg and cut the railroad there. April 1st, of course, around this time is going to be the Battle of Five Forks, so that is what is happening in the Petersburg campaign. At this point, there will be a supply train caught and the contents burned. This was already part of the movements by the Confederates to try to get a new defense line established and abandon Richmond. It would be in this part of April when the Federals would learn of the evacuation of Petersburg, and Richmond, and the stakes would thus increase for the raid. No longer was it a question of denying the supplies going in, now it was going to disrupt further Confederate operations and the retreat of the army. To add to the pressure, though, it would also mean that the Confederate army would be more active in this region. Part of the reason why you have these cavalry raids is that there is a soft shell of defense that the Confederates have, and then once you get past that, you're really not facing a whole lot of resistance, whether that's going to be home guard or militia units. And we saw that all the way back in 1863 with Benjamin Grierson's raid, where he's going to just kind of break through this kind of cavalry shell, and once he gets around them, he's able to really do just kind of whatever he wants. And there are moments of danger, but really that raid is going to be a very successful and be the kind of the blueprint for continued federal cavalry raids, because once again, there's not going to be as many men to go around to defend. Miller would lead a group of troopers to Wytheville in the direction of Lynchburg, being very close to that key city. There was some skirmishing with Vaughan's command there, seeing some casualties. Additionally, a part of the Pennsylvania cavalry would be dispatched to Salem to destroy supplies there. From that point, they would capture a rebel train containing tobacco before moving back toward the main body at Christiansburg. The forays towards Lynchburg and other operations of the raiders to disrupt the Confederate rail and logistics operations are sometimes considered to be another nail in the coffin for the Army of Northern Virginia. Remember that a key failure of the Appomattox campaign, thus as it was, because it wasn't a particularly long campaign, but a key failure of the campaign is actually that Lee has supplies show up to a rendezvous point in his army, and they are not food supplies. They are actually material supplies, and that's not what he needed at that point. He needed to make sure that his army had rations. And this is where also we get into some interesting what-ifs, right? Like you had Sherman and his army that's facing off against Joseph Johnson. If Lee was able to actually combine with Johnson, then not only are you going to get Sherman and Grant's army moving down with the Army of the Potomac and the combined Army of the James, so you have those two forces moving down. You have Sherman's army group as well, and then you have George Thomas, who is kind of like sitting around ready to get into the action as well, even though that's not something that necessarily Grant wants, because he doesn't particularly care for George Thomas. Thomas having attempted to take over his command, or at least not attempted to, he had been assigned his command when he was relieved by Henry Halleck. So Grant is going to hold a grudge against him. But if you can imagine those combined forces, George Thomas's army had just, whipped John Bell Hood not too long ago in 1864 at Nashville. And now if his forces, who are veterans, these are all veteran forces, were to converge on Johnson and Robert E. Lee, then I don't necessarily think it would have been too much of a fight, and we probably would have had the same result of the war coming to a conclusion. So that is something to consider. Skirmishing with Confederates at Martinsville, the superior firepower of the cavalry was on display, as many of them were armed with Spencers. They would rout any resistance in their path. Reportedly, the cavalry was very close to having disrupted Jefferson Davis and his escape. Davis had attempted to establish the new Confederate capital in Danville, but had moved on to Greensboro. Stoneman, in the meantime, had ordered part of his command in that direction. In this operation, they actually charged some Confederate cavalry, coming out with many prisoners. At this point in the war, a lot of the rank and file are going to be demoralized, and certainly with the loss of Petersburg, the Army of Northern Virginia actually kind of seems like it's not until Five Forks and then the loss of Petersburg and Richmond where the morale is just going to kind of plummet. They're still going to have this kind of high morale with Robert E. Lee all the way to the end. It's not quite the same with Joseph Johnson's army, because those are all remnants of other forces, and certainly in the sub-theater, they've been sort of without morale for quite some time. So you're going to see a lot of units just go ahead and start surrendering in droves. This increased activity of the enemy in the area was a direct result of this move further south by the Southern president. Stoneman was intent on continuing the raid further into North Carolina, his destination being Salisbury. Salisbury was the site of a Confederate POW camp and a railroad hub for the Tar Heel State. Remember, there had been emphasis from George Stoneman to free some prisoners, and that's going to be the kind of positive press that he wants to also accomplish, right? He had failed before, and now he wants to be this liberator and kind of bring things full circle. By April 12th, the Federals were approaching the town, and while they had to contend with entrenched enemy positions, there was very little fight left in the rebels. You see, in the meantime, PGT Beauregard had been dispatched to make an independent command out of the Carolinas outside of Johnson's army, which was still around Raleigh. Part of these concentrations, such as they were, would be told that Danville and Greensboro were in danger. This would see Bradley Johnson, who you might remember from the proposed Point Lookout raid in Maryland, to ride north and away from Stoneman's brigades as they continued on to Salisbury. Rebels would form up defensively at a place called Grant's Creek. Interestingly, a ragtag force of Confederates under the command of John C. Pemberton would be the only force left to check Stoneman before hitting the key logistical center. Now, Pemberton, if you remember, had his disgraceful moment in the fall of Vicksburg. Like other generals such as Irvin McDowell, he would receive the unfair moniker of being a traitor. As it was, just kind of the loss at Vicksburg is going to make sure that Pemberton doesn't have any kind of continued career in the army. Remember, at one point, they're going to try to make him into some sort of a commander of Bragg's army, and Bragg already is losing the rank and file on his own, and then Pemberton shows up and they're just going to completely reject the guy because they do not want somebody who's labeled as a big loser to be involved in this venture, and certainly that kind of devolves into it being also a traitor situation. McDowell, if you recall, had been commanding under Pope, and he wore a bamboo hat to cover his head because of the sun, and soldiers were going to start the rumor that he was wearing the bamboo hat to signal to his Confederate spies or whatever Confederate forces were in the area about their troop movement. So that's where things can get off the rails, and even though they're not true, it's going to be kind of hard to come back from that and regain the trust of the individuals in the army. Well, Pemberton had tried on occasion to be re-entered into Confederate service, but the stigma of his failure was enough where many soldiers would refuse to fight. In this capacity, he would be relegated to commanding North Carolina state troops. Many of his command would also include Irish deserters from the Union Army. These individuals had been pressed into federal service and would see their chances better serving under the Confederates than being in POW camps. Cavalry flanking and moving in behind the defensive position would end the brief struggle at Grant's Creek. Over 1,000 Confederates would surrender, Salisbury being open for the taking. Looting would commence in the town, although Stoneman would try his best to force the troopers in his command to honor personal property. What was a huge win would be the capture of a large amount of Confederate stores. According to reports, 10,000 arms, 1 million rounds, 10,000 artillery rounds, 75,000 uniforms, 250,000 blankets, 6,000 pounds of bacon, 100,000 pounds of salt, 20,000 pounds of sugar, 27,000 pounds of rice, 50,000 bushels of wheat, 15 million in Confederate money, and 100,000 in medical stores were captured and destroyed. This also kind of paints the picture that they have all this stuff, right? You know, there's always things to destroy and parts of the army or equipment to destroy on the part of the Union Army. And yet you also have this kind of on the flip side of that where the Confederates are not well supplied. And this kind of highlights just how poor their logistical system is. Like, there is supplies, there is food to go around. I've seen that argued before here recently in some of these sources where, you know, the Confederates might have been able to better feed and equip their soldiers, their armies, but they just lacked that infrastructure to do so. So this is kind of a good example of that. Even in this stage of the war, there seems to be a lot of stuff to go around. Stoneman would be unable to liberate the prison at Salisbury, just as he had been unable to be the hero to the POWs at Andersonville and Macon. North Carolina Governor Zebulon Vance had urged the removal of the prisoners to the coast, where they would eventually be paroled. From Salisbury, Stoneman is going to continue his raid, moving on to Statesville. Once they had left the town, rebel troopers would appear and probably treat the civilian populace worse than other northerners. You see, this was going to be a common problem in this region. Bands of Confederates were oftentimes just as dangerous as the raiders. For this reason, Stoneman would start to attract a large amount of formerly enslaved followers. Now, Stoneman was not an abolitionist, but he would understand the plight of many in the region. He would send some back under escort to Knoxville. The raid would continue, even with the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, and even with Johnson attempting to seek terms. What would be different for the latter half of the raid would be that George Stoneman is going to be sidelined. He was continuing to suffer from hemorrhoids, which maybe saw him destined for a desk job earlier in the war. With his condition worsening, he would realize that he would no longer be able to continue the raid, and by April 17th would leave with some captives and an escort. Now for Stoneman, had he done enough to wash away his previous record? Well, the raid was not going to be a booming success, but it was a success in the terms of disrupting continued Confederate operations. Now you can also argue the operations were very close to ceasing anyway, but the raid was one factor, at least, in closing the door on anything further. Stoneman had destroyed valuable stores and ripped up some track. He had made it seem like Thomas was coming in from Tennessee, converging on the remaining rebels, all of which was valuable to the Union endgame. While maybe not a sweeping success as he had wished for, especially given light to his previous raids during the Chancellorsville campaign and the Atlanta campaign, this was going to be at least one step toward redeeming his name. Recall that those ventures had been at least a little bit wider in scope. I think, though, that just in general, cavalry raids from the north need to be looked at a little bit more closely. Certainly, as the war progresses, there is more opportunity for the Federal horsemen to get into the soft underbelly of the Confederate infrastructure. The Southerners do not have the capability to man their supply lines as the Federal forces would be able to do. In Stoneman's first two raids, this isn't going to be quite the case. In both cases, he's actually going to be facing off with Confederate cavalry, and a considerable amount of them. First in the case of Jeb Stuart, and second in the case of Joe Wheeler. Whereas, say, Benjamin Grierson only has to deal with maybe a brigade-sized force before he's able to continue to raid into Mississippi proper. Here we have an opportunistic strike, timing and location that would see the different outcome than those other two. So I think that is well worth pointing out. It's not necessarily about the grandness of these raids. You have Jeb Stuart, who's going to have this kind of picturesque cavalry we're going to ride around the enemy army and we're going to cause some kind of havoc. Those are good for the newspapers, and certainly it does show the Confederate dominance in cavalry, but kind of the smaller scale raids that you see by these cavalry forces in other regions of the war that maybe aren't even the main theater of the war, but they're going to go a long way into destroying the Confederacy, even if they're not quite on a grand scale as some of these guys probably would have wished. Certainly George Stoneman probably would have wished it to be on a huge scale. With Stoneman now out of the picture, Alvin Gillum would be the remaining leader of the venture. He would have a different view on how to conduct the raid. You see, as we mentioned, he was from Tennessee and would side with the pro-Union Southerners who would wish to wage a harder war. In this region in particular, there would be a good rise in guerrilla activity. Remember that Davis had wished for the dispersing of the army, and this would be the case moving forward to try to prolong the conflict. So in that regard, there would be some argument for the harder war being a check to this kind of resistance. You could make that case. However, I think it is safe to say that both sides, Confederate and Union alike in this region, did not always have the best of intentions. So is it a grand venture to try to crush any kind of continued resistance, right? Is Robert E. Lee's army really dispersing into the hills, or Joseph Johnston's army really dispersing into the hills, and we need to continue this raid to make sure that that doesn't happen, or put in the boot heel on the neck, so to speak? Or is it because we're trying to settle scores and we're trying to loot a little bit? You could kind of make the argument that it's a little bit in the middle for both sides, right? April 18th would see the wholesale looting in the region. While it is true Gilliam had to fight another brief skirmish, he had enough men and firepower to overcome the lesser Confederate forces. Troopers would not only rob civilians in the towns, but also burn mills or anything else of value. Asheville would be the eventual target of the raiders moving into the Blue Ridge Mountains. It would be here where Gilliam would meet with Confederate General John Martin under a flag of truce. Martin had been informed that the negotiations between Sherman and Johnson had included a ceasefire between the two sides. Gilliam in this case would be cordial with his visit with Martin and begin moving his command back toward Tennessee, a possible link-up with Sherman, all the way back up to Durham being in the works. The problem, though, is going to be that Gilliam is going to be more concerned with getting back to Tennessee and throwing his hat into the new ring of politics, especially as the war's conclusion seemed to be in sight. Remember, though, that there had been a breakdown of negotiations with Sherman and Johnson, so the brigades in the field would see it as an okay to resume hostilities. First entering Asheville on the 22nd, two brigades would return, overpowering the small garrison and capturing Martin before a systematic looting of the town on the 26th. It would not be until Palmer was given command of the division that order was somewhat restored. the truce once again called. This would be another infamous act on the raid. Martin would actually see his own home looted by the troopers that had been sent there to protect his family. We do have an account of the raid from a southern perspective, as we are in the back half of it. Dear Walter, we are just through with the scene of alarm and very great danger. Stoneman has just swept through the country with 10,000 cavalry towards Wilkesboro, Salem, Salisbury, Greensboro, Hillsboro, and Raleigh, and we fear there would be no adequate preparation made to meet him. About dark, on Tuesday evening last, the heart of the column reached the factory, and in a few minutes the people around were under guard, and the command in camp. They were equipped with the very best manner under the severest discipline, and were not allowed to plunder to any great extent or commit any acts of violence. They left about 3 o'clock next day, Wednesday, except 2 companies that were left to burn the factory, which they did with great coolness and method. They also set fire to the storehouse and granary. Most of the store, the cotton house, tannery, and oil escaped. The little office joining the store was burned, the last of them left by sundown. They reached Wilkesboro next evening, and by dark taken it by surprise also. We hear that Jess Finley's house was burned, but hope it is a mistake. Many of them said that a large body of infantry was behind. We suppose has gone towards Virginia. So complete was their guard that they were all taken by surprise down the river and lost all of their horses and mules except Gerald Patterson's one little pony, which they couldn't catch, and Rufus, one of which happens to be out of the way. I have not seen Rufus being afraid to leave home. A soldier who was there upon their arrival and made his escape gave us the facts about 2 o'clock that night, and went on to the station. We did all we could in the way of hiding necessities and running off Negroes and stock, but none of them came home. While at the factory, they made Cousin Rufus's room their headquarters and treated him courteously, behaved very sedately at Cousin Ed's, the fort, and other places, but committed no violence. They told Cousin Rufus that their secessionists down the river would fare badly. We supposed that they had their next stop would be Elkin or Janesboro. The force which passed the factory, 6,000, was commanded by Gilliam. Stoneman joined him at Holman's Ford with 4,000. It is said a third column passed through Jefferson and camped over the river from Wilkesboro. I hope that is not so. About 2 days before, a considerable number of Negro men left for Tennessee, and have not been heard from since, including 4 from Fort, 1 General Patterson, 12 E. Jones, and 5 from here. Elias, John, Turner, Jones, and Wash. From the Fort Larkin, Erie, Joe, and Jerry. I have not heard too many went to the cavalry. Some of the officers cursed the Negroes and wished them all in hell. We had been for some time under constant apprehensions about Tory or robber raids, and I have been serving on guard at town every third night, and have been as much as 2 weeks without taking off my clothes. We're always in danger except when a portion of Avery's command is here, which is not very often. Home guard, no account. A few days before these troubles commenced, I received your war song and other piece, which were all very much pleased with them, especially the song which I had the girls make a good many copies and distribute it pretty generally. And I was about to send it the 3 papers, but will now wait until the storm is past. So a couple things to unpack with this particular letter. Number 1, it's going to be more of the beginnings of the raid, right? Stoneman's going to have a pretty strong control all through Salisbury about kind of the destruction of personal property. There is going to be some looting going on in certain areas, but obviously in this particular first-hand account of this civilian, it's not going to be as prevalent where he is. There is kind of the thought process of, and we've seen this in other Union cavalry raids, of just kind of destroying anything that's going to make the war-making capability easier, whether it's a factory, some kind of mill to create larger quantities of food, right? Anything storehouse-wise, that's all going to be burned. But there's going to be generally just kind of a release on any kind of homes or whatnot, and we kind of see that in here. We also have a very interesting point that I think at the back half of this letter is made, where it is said that there is constant danger going on. And we said that actually here very recently in this episode, where if you're not facing any kind of federal cavalry, it's not like you're out of the woods, right? You have pro-Union guerrillas. We've mentioned before in some of these episodes how there's a lot of individuals who are going to not want to join the Confederate Army, and they're going to kind of form their own bands and they're not going to necessarily be acting in the way that a Union raider would, but they would be in conflict with some of these individuals, right? So you're going to not be on good terms with them if they're going to try to attack you. You're going to have deserting Confederates. At this point, there's going to be a lot of Confederates who are deserting or trying to get home, and a lot of them are not going to be too nice about it if they roll through your town. And then you're going to also have Confederates who are just, who've already surrendered and they're moving back, right? So you could kind of have a myriad of different places which you could be assaulted from or have some sort of harm come from, right? So he kind of mentions that how really the only way we're safe is if we have this particular unit. I believe it's a cavalry unit that's kind of sticking around us. And that's the only time when we feel like we can kind of rest easy. However, we're just not going to be able to do that under the present circumstances. So obviously, I think that it highlights that pretty well. And it also highlights kind of the control in which the raid happens in more pro-Union areas. And then when it gets into South Carolina and your more pro-Confederate areas, then it's going to become a little bit harsher. While we have that account, it may surprise you to know that this was not the conclusion of our tale. Palmer would be given orders from Stanton that his command would be used in the apprehension of Jefferson Davis. You see, Stanton is convinced that Davis had given the order to assassinate the president and wanted to bring him to justice. So Palmer would be given the okay to ignore Thomas and Sherman and focus on this task. This would mean the continued foraging and looting would cease. In some cases, there would be still pockets of home guard giving resistance. The command would make its way to Spartansburg and Greenville, heading into South Carolina and Georgia. There would be an unfortunate sacking of Andersonville, South Carolina in early May that would result in a handful of civilian deaths. Even in this latter stage of the war, the raiders would continue to do just that, raid the countryside and not only deprive the waning Confederacy of anything of value, but also would seek personal gain. With the war coming to an end, then it would be the last time that they could profit off such a raid. So there was seemingly a dash to find anything of value at the expense of western South Carolina. The command would eventually make its way to Athens, Georgia, and be in contact with Wilson's raiders, as they were coming up from their Alabama expedition. If you remember, we talked about that in the main narrative, in the Battle of Selma, in which James Wilson gets the better of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Palmer's command would miss out on capturing Jefferson Davis, that honor going to regiments from Wilson, but there would be several key contributions to this effort. Mainly, they had cut off the president and his minimal party, allowing for the apprehension as he was attempting to get to Florida and eventually Cuba. They had captured John Breckinridge and Joe Wheeler, accepting the surrenders of those two officers. Breckinridge had attempted to buy time for Davis to continue his flight. The 15th Pennsylvania would also capture the reserves of the Confederate Treasury, some 188,000 pieces of gold. With these final actions, the raid would come to a close, as many regiments would begin to disband. So we can go ahead and call this episode to a close. We talked about Stoneman's 1865 raid, and I think gone back and done a good job of running it down. As I mentioned, there are actually a handful of other events that we really didn't get to in the main narrative, so maybe there will be similar service down the line. Stoneman's raid is a great example of a later war raid in which you kind of see the Confederacy sort of losing their spirit to fight, and it gives us a good idea of kind of the continued hardship that happens and the continued war that happens, because a lot of times we think that Appomattox happens and then everything just kind of is fine and everyone goes home. Well, it's a good example of how there could be continued animosity, continued violence that could still happen in these regions, and how maybe in some cases the war doesn't necessarily end. If you know somebody who is in your region, like say it's an East Tennessee individual on the other side of the mountain who has come and he's stolen a bunch of your stuff, and then after the war is over, you're like, well, I know where that guy lives, I'm going to go over there. It's kind of like the Champ Ferguson argument that he made in his trial. And we know that Champ Ferguson, along with Henry Wirz, are some of the only Confederates to be executed post-war for some of their crimes, or war crimes, if you will. Champ Ferguson mentioned that in his defense, hey, if I didn't do that to these guys, then they were going to come get me. And he kind of has a point. He has a point that, they've been warring with each other. There's a lot of guerrilla activity. It goes back and forth, but then it's not guaranteed that it's just going to stop, right? Those wounds are going to run a little deep. And so you definitely have a great example of how we could get to that point even as the war is wrapping to a close. Next episode, we are going to return to Antietam. In this case, I think we need to go back in that battle and cover a part of it that we did not necessarily get to in depth. We need to focus specifically on Burnside's Bridge. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback is always welcome. Any kind of questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.